Welcome to the City Club of Portland, Oregon's most respected public forum. The City Club was founded in 1915 as a civic research organization. Today, its members are 2,000 men and women who share a common interest in the quality of life and government in the Portland metropolitan community. The City Club meets on Fridays at noon in downtown Portland to present speakers selected for their distinction in specialized fields, their knowledge of specific issues, and the freshness and vitality of their ideas. This week's speaker is Robert D. Reischauer, the former Deputy Director of the Congressional Budget Office. His topic is the U.S. economic and budget policy, a new beginning or business as usual. And now, the club's presiding officer will present today's speaker.
President Reagan made an urgent appeal for changes in federal economic policy. After pointing out concerns that are familiar to all of us, such as the eroding purchasing power of the dollar because of tax increases and double-digit inflation, declining productivity, adverse effects on employment and business incentive, he proposed comprehensive and substantial cuts in government spending and also a phase-in of certain tax reductions. Few would question the importance or timeliness of his message. The extent to which his message can be translated into action, however, depends largely on Congress. The focal point for that interplay between the President and Congress is the federal budget. During the next several months, Congress will be examining and responding to the President's program. Our speaker today is eminently qualified to address the budget process and U.S. economic policy. During the past 6 years, he has been Deputy Director of the Congressional Budget Office. That's a non-partisan independent agency with a staff of about 200, which gives Congress economic forecasts and analysis, budget estimates, and analysis of policy options. His academic background includes a bachelor's degree from Harvard in 1963, a master's in international relations from Columbia, a doctorate in economics from Columbia, and teaching in economics at Columbia. From 1970 to 1975, he was on the Economic Studies Division staff at the Brookings Institute. He served as a consultant and authored several publications. About a week and a half ago, he became a senior vice president of the Urban Institute, which is a nonprofit research organization based in Washington. The title of his talk today is provocative: U.S. economic and budget policy, a new beginning or business as usual? Question mark. Without further ado, it's my distinct pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker, Robert Reischauer. Robert?
Thank you. It's very nice of you to invite an economist to speak in this era when economists are not held in high repute, specifically economists dealing with the budget and the economy. Walter Heller, the former chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors under Lyndon Johnson, came back from Europe and visiting Poland and was heard to remark that you could tell the low status in which economists were held by the fact that the Poles were telling nothing but jokes about economists. So we're having technical difficulty here. As you've just been told, the president... Things work better than this in Washington.
We're supposed to raise the podium.
There's a switch right here.
The podium will raise, or my legs will shorten. I'll be able to continue this. As you were told, a week and a half ago, the President exercised a little bit of understandable hyperbole and said that we were now experiencing the worst economic mess since the Great Depression in trying to describe the economic and budgetary problems facing the nation. It's clear we are facing extremely serious problems on these two fronts. On the economic front, clearly the number one problem is inflation. Inflation over the last 2 years has risen at a faster rate than during the entire period from 1952 to 1967. We've had a period of slow growth, no growth last year in the economy, and slow in the preceding few years. We have high unemployment in this country relative to what our potential is. Productivity, which is the source of much of the increase in growth and living standards, has fallen for 2 consecutive years. On the budget front, we've faced the problem of extremely rapid rising spending. Spending rose at 17.5% last year. It's predicted to go up by 15% in the year we're in right now. Spending in the federal budget has doubled since 1975. We've had large and persistent deficits, which have bothered people. There's only been one surplus in the federal budget since 1961, and the federal debt is approaching $1 trillion, and 1/2 of that will have been accumulated since 1974. So the thing is snowballing, it appears. We're experiencing high tax rates in this country. If there isn't a tax cut this year, taxes as a fraction of personal income or of GNP will be at their highest level in American history. So there is reason for the frustrations expressed by the American people on that front. Faced with this set of problems, the traditional mainstream institutions and economists and budgeteers have been singularly failing in their ability to provide solutions which have been politically acceptable. This is, I think, brought home rather clearly by the Carter budget proposals of a month ago. He has no real solutions to these problems, sees spending rising at a continued rapid rate, provides a net increase in taxation, and predicts that inflation will continue at a double-digit level. Now into this vacuum of ideas and policies has stepped a new administration with policies that it's heralded as a great new beginning and radical departures from the existing way of thinking about the budget and the economy. The new administration is hoping that these changes will bring about a rapid and substantial diminution of the problems that I've just gone through with respect to the economy and the budget. What I want to do here is briefly to examine and describe those policies to determine, number one, whether they're new and radical and different, and then number two, ask whether, if the Congress adopts these policies, they hold out significant hope for changing the budget and economic outlook over the next few years, or whether we should lower our level of expectations on that front. Okay, what are these policies? The Reagan proposal really has 3 parts, and the first part is regulatory reform and relief. In that area, he has proposed postponing all pending regulations, examining all new and existing regulations to determine whether they provide a net benefit to society rather than just individual groups in society, an attempt to reduce the paperwork which the federal government has burdened the rest of society with, and he has decontrolled oil and eliminated the Council on Wage and Price Stability. Now this package, this element of the package, I would argue, is not particularly different from the policies that have been pursued over the last 4 years. President Carter initiated the Paperwork Commission and was moving rapidly in those directions. The Carter administration brought forth the deregulation of air and rail in this country and worked in the area of communication deregulation and trucking deregulation. Certainly the enthusiasm of the new administration for deregulation is greater than it was during the Carter administration. And there's probably one other significant difference between this administration's approach and the Carter administration's approach, and that is that we're now trying a policy of placing people at the head of regulatory agencies who don't believe in the efficacy of government regulation, that they think there are other ways to go. Now, one can argue that this is a significant departure from past policies, and yet if you step back and think about the recent past, we did have Alfred Kahn as head of the aviation regulatory body, who spent several years deregulating the airline industry. We had Ferris in charge of communication, who spent his tenure in the FCC deregulating the communications industry. So even this maybe isn't a radical departure from the policies of the past. Second leg of the Reagan proposal is spending cuts. And in one sense, these spending cuts are truly radical. And that sense is they're very large. He's suggesting a $41 billion cut for this year, and the cut would grow to about $123 billion, which is 13% of spending out in 1986. One has to abstract from these spending cuts and also remember that the Reagan administration is increasing military spending by some $50-odd billion over the 5-year period, and so the net size of the spending cuts will be smaller, but there's no doubt that these are of historic proportions. Last year, you will recall the Congress and the Carter administration agonized long and hard and came forth with what was thought to be a balanced budget in June, and that involved spending cuts of only $15 billion. So when we're talking $41 billion, and as the newspaper lets you know, there's probably another 5 or 6 to come on top of that, we're talking larger numbers than anybody has ever contemplated before. Are the cuts radically different in nature from past proposals? The answer here is both yes and no. I think there's a general impression that the Reagan administration is out in the field slaughtering the herd of sacred cows, and no one has proposed such a thing before. In fact, a majority probably of the 83 proposals that have been detailed so far are cuts that have been proposed before by Republican presidents, by Democratic presidents. Reductions in student benefits for Social Security program, reductions in the impact aid program, reforms in the disability insurance program. These are cuts which have been proposed year after year in Washington and really are not that different. On the other hand, there are a group of cuts proposed by the Reagan administration which do represent significant change, and that is they are the cuts which have as their rationale the belief that the federal government has no role in a certain area at all. They aren't talking about reducing this by 10% or 20%. They're talking about abolishing the federal role. Conrail, mass transit operating subsidies, the Economic Development Administration, the Appalachian Regional Commission, all of these are scheduled for total elimination, and in that sense, the nature of the spending cuts being proposed are radically different from proposals that have been put before the Congress before. Third leg of the Reagan proposal, of course, is the tax cut package, which has two elements: the personal income tax rate cuts of 5% this year, 10% for each of the next 2 years, and 5% for the year after, and business tax cut, which comes in the form of accelerated depreciation along the lines of the 1053 program. The tax proposals are radically different. There is no mislabeling of them. In two respects that I'll talk about now, and another respect I'll talk about later. The two now are their duration and their size. The tax cut proposed for individuals is for 4 years running. And it's been very rare for an administration or a Congress to be willing to tip its hand on tax policy and loss of revenues for a long period of time in the personal area, and that is what is being done here. Over the 5-year period from 82 to 86, the tax cuts will amount to a package that starts at $54 billion and grows to over $200 billion. By 1986, it represents a 19% reduction in expected revenues. So in terms of size, these are really extremely large and significant. So putting this all together, I would say that on the whole, we are being presented with a package that's radical and is a significant departure from the past policies that have been pursued by the executive branch or by the legislative branch. Now, this proposal has been made to get the economy moving and to regain control of the budget. And this is precisely what the administration foresees happening. With respect to the budget, it foresees a very, very sharp reduction in spending growth. As I told you, we've experienced a 17% growth and a 15% growth of spending per year, and the Reagan proposal would have that drop to 5%, slightly over 5% next year and the following year. Spending as a fraction of GNP would fall from this 23.3% where it is now down to around 19%. Revenues growth would also slow precipitously. We've gone through in the last 3 years 16, 12, and 16% growth in tax take to the federal government, and this would slow next year to 8.5% and then down to 6% the following year. So the Reagan administration would see a major deceleration of spending and taxes in the United States, and as a result, a balanced budget by 1984. Now, 1984 is a far cry from 1982, which was promised during the campaign, or 1983, which was talked about during the transition period, but it is a realistic target to hold out for the American people. The budget scenario that I just described, of course, depends crucially on an economic package of assumptions. And here, the administration is probably even more optimistic. It sees the inflation rate, which is running around 12% now, dropping down to 5.5% by 1984. It sees real growth, which was 0 last year, and most people are predicting will be close to 0 this year, rising up to the range between 4 to 5%. Sees the unemployment rate falling from a little under 8% for this year down to 6.5% for 1984. Let's look now at the policy, which, as I said, I think is a radical departure from the past, and ask whether it's likely to bring off these dramatic changes in the economy and in the budget. First, I'd like to say a few words about the overall fiscal policy that's inherent in this package. 1982 to 1984 fiscal years, we're going to get spending cuts of around $230 billion, forgetting about the added $56 billion for defense, and tax cuts of $311 billion. Using the old and maybe discredited tools of my trade, most economists would say that tax cuts being slightly larger than spending cuts will be, on balance, marginally inflationary. Probably not too much of an impact. It's a relatively neutral policy. Spending's being cut, taxes are being cut. The overall intervention of the federal government into the economy is not too different from what it would be without these cuts on both sides. Now, the defender of the administration would have 3 arguments to make against that statement that I've just made. First, they would say you can't look to these old and discredited tools. We're trying something that's radically different, and there's no historical basis for it, and macroeconomic models, by and large, are estimates of past historical relationships. And so you can't rely on them when you're talking about significant structural changes in the economy. That's an argument which we could talk about all afternoon and there would be no resolution of. Also, a defender of the administration's policy would say it's not the aggregate amounts that make any difference. What we're really talking about is the composition of the tax cut and the composition of the spending cuts. And we've designed these in such a way as to unleash the creative and acquisitive genius of the American people and American industry, which too long has been burdened by regulation, government taxation, and overall controls. Third, a defender of the administration's policy would say that much of the response that they expect, much of the improvement in the economy and the budget we're talking about here, won't come through traditional channels anyway. They'll come rather through changed psychological conditions, that the perception that there is a new beginning out there will bring about these changes. Ed Meese, I think, said that he expected 80% of it to be due to psychology and only 20% to economists. My quip about that is that the psychologists of America should defend themselves or their reputation will be as bad as economists 4 years from now. Okay, let's look at the composition of this tax and spending proposal and some of the factors that might affect the psychology, although given that I'm not a psychologist, you don't have to be attentive to my words on that front. Composition of the spending cuts, I would argue that there's nothing in them that looks like it would give any overwhelming impetus to either economic growth or to lower inflation. Some of the subsidies businesses depend on now have been axed, and that won't affect inflation in anything but a positive way. And the cuts in social programs, I don't see as having any tremendous growth impetus to them. As I said, there are some of these cuts which will increase the direct costs to business. Conrail subsidies being eliminated, postage subsidies being reduced, so stamp prices will go up. Rural Electrification Administration no longer can get cheap money from the Federal Financing Bank, so electric rates will go up when it borrows money. There are a series of increased taxes and fees proposed, like for yacht owners or for use of inland waterways by barges or for airport user fees, and that will all feed into ticket prices, transport prices, whatever, in upward directions. There's cuts that will affect state and local governments to the extent that state and local governments pick up the tab for this with increased spending of their own, relying more heavily on property or sales taxes. Those both feed into the consumer price index. Those will push things up. Let me say right now that I wouldn't regard the inflationary impact of any of these cuts as a significant thing to consider when you are saying, is this the right way to go? I think many of these proposals are superb, but there's nothing in them that's going to bring the CPI plummeting to the ground, is what I want to suggest. There are several cuts which would have a deflationary effect. The reduction of dairy price supports, the various reforms to unemployment insurance and food stamps should improve the workings of the labor market in such a way as to maybe reduce wage pressures. But these are a minority. There are more things on the other side that would raise prices. Well, forget about economics. Let's talk psychology. Maybe there's, in these spending cuts, there's a message of great retrenchment that the level of government spending is going to drop. And it's true. If they reach the objective laid out for them, the 19.3% of GNP, spending as a fraction of our economic system will be down to the lowest level since 1966. So that could have some important effect if you reach it. Let me now turn to the composition of the tax cuts. On the business side, the Reagan proposal is much larger tax cuts, although not different in composition particularly, than Carter. He's proposing over the next 4 years a reduction of $61 billion. Carter was proposing $45 billion. Should we expect then a huge difference in behavior of American industry given these two policies? I think not. It's a 5 percentage point difference in the tax take over the 5-year period, and I don't see that swinging the economy one way or the other. Plus, it's not as generous as the Senate Finance Committee tax plan of last year. So, we're in a situation where the composition of the business tax cut is not something that would be radically different from what was assumed by Carter or the congressional budget process. Irrespective of that, there are limits to the impact that all of this can have on inflation. The Joint Economic Committee had a report done for it that estimated the impact of raising business fixed investment in this country by 15% a year over the next decade, and asked if we could design a tax policy which would generate that much new investment in the economy, how much gain in productivity would there be, and how much reduction in inflation would that be? And the answer was that by 1990, you get about a 2 percentage point reduction in prices. So if we were at 12, we could get down to 10. It's not something that brings the inflation rate to its knees. Psychologically, could business be very pleased with this tax package and therefore change its behavior? If I were a businessman, I wouldn't be, for one reason, and that is this tax package is skewed towards individuals. Historically, about 2/3 of tax cuts have gone to individuals, 1/3 to businesses when we have a tax cut. Senate Finance Committee last year was working on a plan that was about 50-50. This plan, by 1984, individuals would get 80% of the cut and businesses only 20%. So historically, this is really skewed very much towards individual tax relief, not towards business. The size of it's large, the total size of it's large, but the emphasis is more towards individuals. Well, what about individuals? Will these large tax cuts feed into increased savings, increased investments that will then lower inflation? By historic standards, this tax package is a tax package that's skewed towards the rich, and that's precisely what you should do if you want to increase investment and savings. But our notion of a tax package skewed towards the rich is a fairly biased notion. While this package is very skewed by historical standards towards the rich, 75% of the tax relief will go to people with incomes under $50,000. And it would be my judgment that these folks have been having a hard time paying the grocery bill over the last few years, and they aren't going to chunk a whole lot of the money into savings that then can be used for investment. It's a tax package skewed in the right direction, but there are limits to this. We're giving most of the money to where most of the people are, which is in the middle and lower income tax brackets. What about psychological factors? We have the feeling we're overtaxed. If we adopt this package and taxes go down precipitously, will that change our mood? Well, if we adopt the Reagan tax package, taxes as a percent of GNP will fall from 21.1% where they are now all the way down to 19.3%. I would argue that's significant, that's a good direction, but it's not going to have much of an impact because that's exactly where we were in 1978. And we were at a lower rate of effective taxation from 1971 to 78. And I don't remember those years as the years of outpouring business vitality or individual savings. They were just the opposite. Let me look at one other psychological element, and that is the deficit. A lot of attention's been given to the deficit. Maybe there's something in this package that we can look at and say that's the thing that's going to trigger it all. In fact, over the 1981 to 84 period, the Reagan proposal calls for deficits that are a little more than twice as large as what Carter had in his last budget. And so, in fact, we're going to have, if you believe the numbers, larger deficits over the next 4 years than we would have had under Carter. Now, there's lots of reasons to argue that Carter's numbers were relatively phony. I would argue also that there are lots of reasons to believe that the Reagan numbers are phony, both of them in the same directions. The relative phoniness is one that is difficult to evaluate, but the point, I think, can be made that there isn't going to be a huge difference in the magnitude of the deficits over the next 2 or 3 years under the Reagan proposal versus under the where Carter was going. Let me conclude by saying that the budget and economic proposals are on balance quite radical and significantly different. But in my view, they're unlikely to cause a sharp improvement in the current economic problems that we're facing. And this is so for one reason. It's because despite the rhetoric of the last few years, government policies, by and large, are not single-handedly responsible for the economic problems that are facing our country. And conversely, therefore, you can't change government policies around a lot and expect them to have a huge impact on the economy. There is a danger in all of this, and that is that if the nation accepts the Reagan proposal, we might find ourselves in a slightly worse situation than we are now, or a not significantly better one, and then the temptation will be to move towards more radical solutions to the problems that we have now, rather than to admit that the problems are just extremely difficult and will take years to work off. Now, I was going over my notes before this, and I thought, what a terrible thing to leave you with on this note of despair. And so let me try and cheer you up a bit. It's economists work in relatives. Even this won't be very good news, but it being better than what you heard before, you might be on the right path to happiness for the weekend. And this is to say a few words about whether I think we'll have business as usual, that Congress and the interest groups in Washington will take the Reagan proposal and chew it up and throw it on the ground, and not much will happen, and the government will go off on its merry way of spending and taxing and larger deficits and all of that. I think the answer here is no, because a fundamental change has been occurring in this country, or at least in Washington. It probably has always been true out here. There's been a fundamental change in the way people are looking at government policy, that for the last few years, there have been no real big major programs. We went through the 60s and the early 70s introducing new large programs every year. That has come to a halt with the exception of increased defense spending in the Congress. It's not something that Reagan has brought about. It's something that's been occurring for the last 2 or 3 years. More significantly, probably, is the fact that the metric of success in Washington has changed. That several years ago, a lobbyist for the dairy industry, if he had gone back to the annual convention and said, I haven't added 2 new programs to your arsenal of subsidies, nor have I increased your level of real benefits after inflation by 10%, he'd be fired. and they'd go out and hire a new lobbyist. Now, that lobbyist can go back to his constituency and say, of the 10 programs we have 9, and we only lost 2% nominally in funding, therefore we're only being hit by 15%, and they'll throw their arms around him and say, you've done a great job. This is a tremendous change in the way Washington operates, and something that shouldn't be belittled, especially in a time of rapidly rising inflation. Inflation is one way that relative budget priorities can be shifted very, very dramatically, and people's programs can be reduced in a real sense very rapidly. If you have 13% inflation for 4 years and you keep the value of a grant program constant in nominal terms, you've halved it. And so there is a silver lining to the inflation cloud here, and we maybe shouldn't judge the Congress or the success of the Reagan proposals on the basis of whether the specific package he has proposed goes through, but rather whether spending is being cut in real terms from is going up only 9% instead of 17% last year. And if we do achieve that, we've achieved a major change in the way government policies operate. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Before I go to questions from the floor, I'm going to exercise a prerogative of the chair and ask a question. Robert, I'd like you to comment on the Congressional Budget Office in 2 respects. One, what it did to change the relationship before it came into being, and secondly, what might be done to, we'll say, improve congressional oversight over the budget.
Okay, you can't really divorce the Congressional Budget Office from the whole budget process as such. And the major changes that have been brought about by the budget process is that it is a mechanism by which the Congress is forced now to vote on budget and economic policy. Before this process came about, congressmen could be for a balanced budget, for low taxes, and for every spending program. You voted individually on each program. Nobody ever tied the whole package together and said, what's it all going to cost, and how does that match up against revenues, and what does that mean the deficit's going to be? Now they have to. They have to take a recorded vote on those factors, and when they do engage in policies that would break the limits they set for themselves, they explicitly have to stand up and change those limits. The second thing the budget process has done is it has created on Capitol Hill a level of expertise and understanding about the economy and the budget that is matched, that matches that in the executive branch. Before the budget process came along, congressmen and senators were tremendously dependent on information out of the executive branch. Now they aren't. They have their own arm, the Congressional Budget Office, that does economic forecasting. They have the Congressional Budget Office, which can take that package and say, these are the savings you think that will result from it, executive branch. This is another view. They might be higher, they might be lower. This is the executive branch's view of what the impact will be on the economy. Here's another view. And that is, I think, terribly important. What can be done to strengthen the congressional budget process? One problem Congress faces is it deals with the budget on an annual basis. And it's very hard to change anything as large as the federal budget in any significant way when you're only looking 1 year ahead. And so probably the most important thing it could do is shift its focus to a multi-year one, to begin acting on 2-3 year ahead budgets. There has been a movement in this direction. The second thing that is seriously needed is an effort to strengthen the enforcement procedures of the budget process. Right now, the enforcement procedures operate solely on the aggregate numbers. Aggregate amounts are set for how much spending will be. Individual committees go off and pass separate appropriation bills that might sum up to much more than that aggregate. The buzzers and alarms sound only when the aggregate has been breached. It might be the first appropriation bill that went through that was twice as big as it should have been, not the fellow who came in last and caused the buzzers to go off. And there has to be a concerted effort to change that situation, and there are complex ways to do it. But those are the two.
Thank you. We'll now go to questions from the floor. City Club members, please identify yourself. We do have a microphone, and if you don't get to the mic, I'll do my best to repeat the question. Herb?
I'm Herb Crane, a member. You opened your remarks by stating that in recent weeks, President Reagan had indulged in hyperbole in describing the current state of the economy. And then you restated the current state of the economy in probably more hyperbole than the president used. I don't understand the relationship.
The questioner asked whether you're using more hyperbole than President Reagan did.
The worst economic mess since the Great Depression is not 7.4% unemployment, which we have now, when we had 8.9 in the mid-1970s. The level of employment in this country is up. Business and consumer spending is weak, to be sure, but is not declining right now. I think you'd have a hard time saying that these times are worse than they were during the mid-1970s, is what I would.
All right, I'll take the questioner at the mic.
Louis MacArthur, City Club member. I'm addressing my question to a remark you made concerning the tax cut and the people who are going to benefit from this. You indicated that you didn't feel it would be as effective as perhaps some people thought because of the people who are receiving the maximum benefit. It seemed to me that the purpose of the tax cut as announced is to obviously increase capital formation in the country. It also appears to me that one thing that's occurred in the United States over the period in question here since in the last 25, 30 years is a more equal distribution of income level, primarily in the middle class bracket. Traditionally hasn't been one of the responses to an economy that is getting more equally distributed like this, and the question of capital formation been to
State your question, please.
Is to increase taxes and to centralize capital formation with the government or a central planning agency. Do you think that Reagan's program, if it's not going to be effective, have we got an alternative which will be, other than the one I just mentioned?
Sir, first of all, I would not personally want to go to an economy in which the government was responsible for a large measure of private capital formation. I was suggesting not that these tax cuts don't move in the right direction. I was suggesting that they won't have a radical, they won't cause a radical increase in capital formation, the personal tax cut side of it, that there are ways to make personal tax cuts flow more into savings and investment than he has chosen than a simple 10% across the board rate cut, and that these won't be tremendously effective. None of the policies we have will, in my judgment, will bring forth a radical change in capital formation. It doesn't mean we shouldn't move along the lines he's suggesting at all. It's just that we can't get the response out of these policies that he has assumed.
Yes, the gentleman over here.
I have a very moral question to ask. You tell us that our $50 billion expenditure for the military is inevitable, and I'm concerned to read that we now have on hand enough ammunition to blow up all life upon the planet 4 times over. Why in the dickens are we spending $51 billion to kill us over and over again?
Why are we spending $51 billion on defense to kill people over and over again?
It's even worse than you thought. This is the first time I've been asked a moral question. Usually people from Washington are considered incapable of moral answers. We're going to spend well in excess of $150 billion on defense. The ability to kill every human being on the earth several times over doesn't help you in achieving many of the missions that our military strategy is designed to achieve, namely how to get oil out of the Persian Gulf. There would be no need for it if we used those sorts of weapons. We're spending it on increased pay for military people. We're spending it on rapid deployment force. We're spending it on a lot of programs that don't have much to do with our nuclear arsenal. We are spending it, to be sure, on Trident submarines, on the MX missile, on conceivably a new manned bomber, which do feed into the nuclear arsenal. And the feeling among military experts is that we have to, because the weapons that we have now are vulnerable, that they might be able to blow up every man, woman, and child 4 times over on the earth, but that means they'll blow up every American 3,000 times because they won't get off the ground here. And the idea is transporting them to someplace else. And that's what we're spending it on, is the transport system.
Yes, the questioner at the mic.
Grossman, I'd like to get you back to your more optimistic, pessimistic mood which you discussed before. And that is, what radical changes economic changes do you envision as possibly helping if the present setup doesn't work as you implied it might not?
Well, okay, I'll ruin your weekend. I quite frankly am fairly pessimistic. I think a democratic process and a democratic system designed the way it is right now is incapable of efficiently dealing with a high inflation set of circumstances in the United States. Let me say that that doesn't mean there's a flaw with democracy. It has to do with the way our society is structured in lots of little ways. And I'll just use one example. And the one example would be wage determination in labor markets. That unlike the Germans and the Japanese, we have a competitive situation between management, labor, and government. And this is the way our process has evolved over 100 years. When I think there's a general agreement in this country and in the Congress certainly that there is a need to provide more incentives for American business to invest in private productive capital. It will be for the good of all of us in future years. We have to reduce consumption to do that. That means tightening our belts as citizens and consumers in various ways. In Germany and Japan, government, industry, and labor sit down and say, yeah, that has to be done, and labor asks for less in the way of wage increases. In this country, we don't do that. We perceive that it's a tax break that's going into the pockets of the fat cat capitalists, or that the government's ripping us off if it's trying to accumulate capital for investment in some way. And our processes don't work. We have a more competitive form of society than the Japanese, whereby I'm a worker at Mitsubishi and they come with this story and say, got to take 3% less next year. I'm part of that family. I live in a Mitsubishi house. I go to a Mitsubishi vacation home in the summer. When my productivity begins slipping, they don't fire me. They keep me on. When their business is bad, they don't throw me out on the street for unemployment insurance to the extent that the Americans do. They keep me on. And I have a stake in that company over a much longer period of time. American industrial capitalism doesn't work that way, and so it's not easy to get the forms of sacrifice that are necessary through a democratic system like ours. I think we'll muddle along. It won't get worse, but it won't improve radically.
We have 60 seconds for a final question.
Harry Somm, City Club member. Based upon your last comments and also on the comment you made before about that the debt has been increasing, I would say exponentially since '74, what do you think the chances are that we're going to be able to avoid triple-digit inflation with the destruction that that would obviously bring?
The wonderful thing about being an economist with numbers is you can always pull out another number that will contradict something you said before. And I stand guilty of hyperbole before, and will confess my sin to you by saying, don't worry about the public debt. The deficit has, the debt has doubled since 1975, but the debt as a fraction of GNP has been declining. It's been declining since 1952, with the exception of 1 year. In other words, what's the burden we're handing on to our children relative to their incomes or society as a whole? The answer is it's a whole heck of a lot smaller than our parents gave to us. Despite this, I would argue we don't want the deficits that we've had because the economy has been tighter than it was, and we want to have more fiscal policy restraint in this country. What was your question?
What do you think the chances are of triple digits?
Oh, triple digit, that's right. Zero. But I'm the same guy who in 1968 would have said double-digit inflation was had a zero possibility. So, no. There are some forces working for acceleration, but there's a lot of forces working the opposite direction. We've been through a very unusual set of circumstances which involve the redistribution of power and oil in the world, which involve the changing of the world agricultural market from one of surplus to one of scarcity, and we've shot ourselves in the foot 8 or 9 times during this decade through policy changes. Not that they weren't right, but decontrol of domestic oil. You're saying you want to keep down inflation, and you do that. Well, we had to do it at some point. Fine, but it's been pushing up inflation. We've gone through a tremendous reform in banking, in which we no longer are pillaging the accounts of little old ladies. So that young people can get subsidized mortgage money. Now people who want to buy a house have to pay the same rates as people who want to buy a car, and that's good, it's right, it's going to improve the efficiency of markets, but it's caused the inflation rate to rise over the last 4 years. These things won't occur. A lot of them are the types of things that have been around for a long time. We're going to have to swallow them sooner or later. We've swallowed them. So they will be forces bringing down the inflation rate. There'll be others pushing it up. Don't expect a lot of change.
What are Reagan's chances of getting this program through?
I'm sorry, our time is up. I think the last question you wanted some more hyperbole, but our time has run out. I want to thank you very much, Robert, for a very informative and stimulating talk. Next Friday, we have the report on the legislature. A week from next Wednesday, we have the afternoon meeting on school closures, and 2 weeks from today, we have the debate with the city council candidates. We are adjourned, and I thank you.
Next week, the City Club Committee report on the structure of the Oregon Legislative Assembly will be presented for discussion and vote at the Benson Hotel, the Mayfair Room at noon. City Club meetings are videotaped on Fridays by Liberty Cable Television Incorporated and can be regularly seen on the following Monday at 2 p.m. and 7 p.m. over this cable channel. This program is intended for the private use of our viewing audience and may not be used otherwise without the expressed and written permission of the City Club of Portland.